Hello and welcome back to our little series on spirituality and church architecture. This is number 10 in the series and we're going to be discussing Romanesque. Now it's very difficult to put a precise date on what's come to be called Romanesque. Elements of the style were prevalent from about 900 to about 1140 AD. Of course, it wasn't known as Romanesque at the time. It was a name that was given later, and it means art or architecture that isn't exactly Roman, but it's Roman-like, because it copies some of the elements of the architecture from the height of the Roman Empire. Nobody woke up one day and decided that it was time for a new architectural style. It grew out of the faith and the traditions of the Christians of the past. These barrel vaults and groin vaults make a widespread comeback, partly because political stability means you can be more adventurous, and the rediscovery of working with heavy stones. Roman architecture didn't completely die out in some parts of Europe, and there were lots of Roman remains for people to be inspired by. But what we'll observe is that it's going to be a bit off. It's going to remind us of the architecture of the classical world, but it's going to have some unique features of its own. This Romanesque style became international, not just local, and that was for several reasons, some of them historical and political, prestigious, economic most certainly, and some of them religious too. First, just a little bit of history. After the great barbarian invasions and the sacking and pillaging of these great sites of the classical world, things are settling down a bit. The foreign invaders have by and large converted to Christianity. There's still a lot of infighting, but things have begun to be stable enough for trade and commerce to thrive. As you can see, the GDP, the per capita, soars in Western Europe between the years 1000 1500. Cities begin to expand, and there's a lot more cash or resources around for people to be more adventurous. The Vikings and the Attonians were some of the last of the invading hordes, as you can see from this map. And the Otto repelled the Magyar invaders in 955, and the Attonian dynasty then succeeded the Carolingians in what became the Holy Roman Empire, in which Romanesque flourished. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is sometimes known as the Norman invasion of England, but the Normans were actually indigenized Viking Christians who'd been given land in exchange for peace by the French king. And this certainly had an effect on church architecture in England, but what we call Norman architecture in England was present well before the Normans arrived. It had already been adopted. Of course, all the normal anxieties considered, just because things were getting a little bit stable, doesn't mean that there was always war and famine and plague, but added to this was this sort of millennial expectation. Would Jesus come back in 1000? Would he come back in 1033? So some of the great western doors of these Romanesque churches are often decorated with images of Christ returning in glory to judge between the good and the bad. And of course, Islamic invasions were continuing to make inroads into Europe at the time, though they were repelled in 732 by Charles Martel, who expelled the Muslims from most of Western Europe. Feudalism, obviously, was the dominant system at the time. It had very precise relationships between lords and serfs. There was a lot of surplus wealth that resulted from this period of stability, and also the reclaiming of land for agriculture with the increasing population and increasing technological advances in agriculture. So there was a rise of wealthy patrons, and with them came more elaborate building projects. During the First Crusade, kings leave their countries behind, and there's a political vacuum, space for some of this ready cash to be used by the church and others to build their own places. And we will see that this is particularly the case in France with Abbé Suger of Saint-Denis in the first Gothic. Without the Crusades, you could probably say that Gothic art would never have happened in that way. The churches also start to become more complex. They get bigger. And some of these changes are due to purely religious rather than economic or stylistic changes. We're going to look at the rise of the cult of relics and the importance of pilgrimage next time. But today we're going to start looking at some other religious and spiritual influences that were brought to bear to bring the Romanesque style to its flourishing. The decisions of the Second Council of Tours, which took place in 567, slowly began to take effect. There was a much sharper distinction now between the chancel and the nave, because the Council of Tours forbade lay people to stand amongst the clergy during the celebration of the liturgy. It also covered a couple of other topics. The sanctuary gates were supposed to remain open so that the faithful could go and pray before the altar unless there was a service going on. Married bishops should treat their wives as sisters. Priests and monks were never allowed to share their bed with somebody else. And in fact, dormitories became the norm. If a monk had a familiarity with a woman, he was going to be excommunicated. No woman was allowed to enter the monastery. Married priests and deacons and subdeacons should have their wives sleep together with the maidservants. And some Gallo-Roman customs, it was noted, of ancestor worship was still being observed, and the Council of Tours excommunicated those people. They barred them from receiving communion and forbade them from entering churches. Now, in the middle of the 8th century, Pepin the Short, king of France, decreed that the Roman liturgy had to be adopted all over the empire, and services were supposed to be in standardized Latin following the Gelasian sacramentary. And the effect of this was that the church no longer felt like a communion of God's varied, redeemed people in different areas. There was far more emphasis on the hierarchy, a standardization of the way things happened. The clergy came to represent Christ as the head, the ruler, the sanctifier, the teacher. The theologian Isidore of Seville emphasized the significance of the Eucharist as a special mystery of the church. And of course, the priest was the one who did it. He alone recited the words of consecration in a quiet voice. So the effect of this is this slightly jumbled feel of those early churches was banished, and demarcation became the rule. The altar then moved to the rear of the apse, and the bishop's throne was moved from this central place to the side. So you can see here at the apse of St. John in Lateran in Rome, the papal seat is still front and centre. But as the Romanesque period moved along, that throne or the presider's seat was moved to the side, and these sedilla became popular places for the clergy to sit, sometimes built into the wall, the east wall, the north wall of the church's apse. The circle of seats in the apse you can see here in Santa Maria Assunta, Venice, in Torcello in Italy, was changed into these seats that were facing each other across the chancel. And this really strengthened this idea that there's a very basic distinction between the nave and the sanctuary. In some places, you can see here in Norwich on the left, the ancient position of the presider or the bishops being kept there at the far end of the apse, but he also has another seat in the choir stalls, in a canopied stall for the bishop in Norwich Cathedral. Music became increasingly important. It became increasingly elaborate, thanks to the spread of Gregorian chant. It was also a way that the laity could continue to contribute in churches. Here you can see in the Romanesque Basilica, or the Cathedral of St. Mark's in Venice, dated from 1063, These huge stone vaults help with the projection of sound. You can hear at the back of the church thanks to this vaulting. It isn't a wooden roof that's absorbing the sound or containing it. It's allowed to echo about. These early pulpits also sprung up, and they were places for singing the exultet primarily and proclaiming the gospel. And you can see here that they're strongly associated with the Paschal candlestick in Santa Maria in Cosmedin in Rome, and the Basilica of St. Lawrence outside the walls, also in Rome. The Paschal candlestick is very firmly associated with the pulpit. Just a couple of quick terms. Here we have round arches. As you can see, if it's spaced widely apart and the walls are not thick enough, the arch is going to collapse. The solution is to make the walls thicker, but even that isn't enough sometimes. They add these pinnacles to weigh down the side walls so that the arch can go higher and the is not so much in danger of falling down. On the right-hand side also you can see the addition of these flying buttresses. These basilicas with wooden trussed roofs continued to exist here, as you can see, but slowly these flat roofs were replaced with vaulting. The Romans had them, obviously, the Basilica Maxentius, but they died out because of a lack of skill and also a lack of need. The churches were relatively small. They didn't need these huge roofs. However, stone roofs don't burn down, so they have this huge appeal after the barbarian invasions when many of these churches were burned. Things can look very heavy in these churches because if you end up with a barrel vault, a heavy barrel vault with stone, you have to have plenty of these thick walls and piers to support them, or columns. This move towards these barrel vaults starts in small ways and in small places. Here you have Santa Maria del Naranco. Basically, they ended up with a stone roof because they ran out of wood. They'd cut down all of the big trees to make charcoal and coppiced them so that they sprang up with little twigs that they could cut down and burn to make charcoal. So the interior here has a vault. A barrel vault. A vault is basically an arch along a long dimension, an elongated dimension, with scaffolding put in place until the arch is completed. You can see here this wonderful little church. It had been built as a palace initially. The Visigoths were familiar with Byzantine architecture. They travelled around a lot, and the square capitals here have this Byzantine influence as to these little medallions that you can see between the arches. This is the church of St. Philibert in Tournus in Burgundy. It was built around 1000 AD. It has these little barrel vaults. Instead of running long ways, they run side to side across the aisle. They have to put in these transverse arches. You can see them in different coloured stones on the right-hand side there, stretching over to support these transverse barrel vaults. And because they're transverse, they allow a lot of light to come into the church, unusually. Instead of just having one long arch down the middle, they've got side-to-side arches with windows on the east and the west. On the bottom there you can see this Romanesque capital. It's this unconventional amalgamation of all three Roman styles, the Doric, the Ionic and the Corinthian. So you've got this funny little trifle of styles that would have been glued together that you wouldn't see in the Roman classical world. At the bottom you can see also a medallion mosaic of June, the month of June, and the activities that would take place in that month. And these really flourish in the Gothic period in the portals of churches and great cathedrals. Here you can see Saint Piquenz in Cardona in Spain, 1019 AD. And this is rather a showpiece and very unusual. It's built in stone, and where the nave meets the transept, and these funny little three apses that it has, a dome roofs the space. It's the first known example in Western Europe of a basilica-plan church with a dome. We saw plenty of that in the Byzantine world, but not so much in the Western world. So it's very high. It's got this very sophisticated stonework. The blocks are of a uniform size. Several churches like this were built by the Benedictines for their enclosures, though most of them still had wooden roofs. This is a unique example here. Little lancet windows also piercing these very, very thick walls that are upholding the barrel vaults and the dome. Now we can see here St. Nicholas's Church in Leicester, which was a Roman settlement built within the Roman city using these recycled materials from the earlier bathhouse and forum that had stood roughly on the place. You can see that this Romanesque style was already present in England before the Normans heightened its adoption. You can see that all sorts of roof tiles and bricks, limestone, slate were incorporated into this building. There's also a famous tile there from the Roman period that has a cat's paw print in it. The cat had got in the way as the clay tile was drying. Here you can see the Chapel of St. John in the Tower of London. Of course, this is a prestigious place for the Normans. They established the Tower of London as a royal residence. It has a chapel in it that adopts a very forceful Romanesque style, or a style that came to be called Norman. It's constructed of stone imported from Caen in France. Here is the Abbey of Saint-Etienne in Caen, built in Caen stone, obviously, and it's founded by William the Conqueror, who was buried here after a rather grisly interment. Lanfranc was its abbot before he became the Archbishop of Canterbury, called over by William the Conqueror. The interior has very interesting features. This is a good example of a gallery here that you can see on the left-hand side, the middle layer, on top of these lower aisle arches. But how are they going to integrate these two layers with each other? Are they going to emulate past Roman architecture in the way that they integrated these various levels of the building? Or are they going to do something different? Here is a picture of the Colosseum by Piranesi, or an engraving of it anyway. Look very carefully at how the Colosseum is arranged. It's stacked. It's like a cake. It's got layers on layers. You can see the bottom is Doric, the middle is Ionic, the top is Corinthian, then we have a little gallery at the very, very top there, a fourth layer. There's one column on either side of the arch in all three cases, and they're separated from each other by this very strong horizontal string course. We can see that has adopted in these basilicas in Rome. This is Santa Sabina. It's essentially a covered forum. So you've got the very strong horizontal feel to it with these side aisles, then a plain wall, and then the clerestory over the top and a flat roof. So it looks longer than it looks high. But here we have the famous church of Saint-Etienne in Caen, in France. What has happened here? Each arch has multiple composite columns. There isn't just one column that's supporting it, but a little cluster of them. Not only that, this strong horizontal feel to the building has been replaced by a sort of height, because the column goes from the floor to the spring of the dome. The column isn't just discrete to each level, it's stretched all the way up to the top. That is a distinctive Romanesque development, and the Romans would have thought it slightly strange that you would have a column that interrupted these horizontal levels. So they have these compound piers, they're called, compound columns. Another thing that you can notice is that they have this gallery or triforium, and sometimes people say, "Now, what was that for? Why is that level there?" Well, it's the middle level very often between the ground floor and the clerestory up near the roof. Well, it could be used as a seating space for clergy or monks or important guests, well out of the way of the mess in the nave where people were milling around. There were no pews, no chairs. Everybody had to stand up. But if you had a little triforium there, people could probably sit down and make themselves comfortable and not be interrupted. Secondly, it may have influenced how the sound travelled. It gave further echoing chambers to the nave. In some Romanesque churches, it was a walkway as well. It was a speedy way of getting from the front to the back of the church if the nave was full of people. But it was, of course, primarily decorative, and it became shallower and shallower as time went on. It was imitating the Roman style of stacked arches over the top of each other. And of course, architecturally, perhaps it also reduced the heaviness of the wall, so it allowed a little bit more height and a window space above. So we've moved now from these churches like St. Paul's without the walls in Rome that rely on these large and thick expanses of mosaic or painted walls to these churches that are modelled in 3 dimensions. You can see these organised systems of these superimposed arches that are raised in tiers with clusters of columns. The hard walls are all being broken up with this range of interlocking and beautiful arched shapes, each with their own cluster of columns, as in Saint-Etienne that we just observed. It's also the golden age of fonts, the Romanesque, these heavy stone fonts that stayed in place for multiple baptisms. We don't really see this in some of the earlier churches. And we can see on the left-hand side St. Mary sub Castro in Dover Castle, built in about 1000 AD, so before the Norman invasion. And we can see here that by the early Romanesque period, there's a very sharp distinction between the chancel and altar from the people's nave. So we've got this sharp distinction that is now firmly in place. Here's Winchester Cathedral. It's the north transept, built 3 years after the Norman invasion. All the elements of the Romanesque are present. We've got the stretched column here on the right, still Corinthian on the top, or some particular style. I don't think it's Corinthian, actually. I think it looks more like a square capital in almost Byzantine style. But the column stretches all the way up. At the bottom there, the columns are clustered in groups. You've got these tiers imposed over the top of each other. In England, the style came to be called Norman. The quality of the stonework still leaves a little something to be desired, but as we will see, as the Romanesque proceeded and merged into the Gothic, the quality of the stonework became absolutely outstanding. And though it became an international style, Romanesque, local variations existed, following the traditions that were respected of the earlier Christians who were there. They didn't say those people were old-fashioned and did things wrongly. They integrated the work of those, especially the decorative work of those early Christians, and jumbled them up together with the Romanesque style. This is Durham Cathedral on the left, the aisle walls. You can see these wonderful interlocking arches that remind you of the Anglo-Saxon gospel books that were produced before what we call the Romanesque style was in place. So it's not as if those earlier designs disappeared. Finally, remember that the interior of these churches were often covered in beautiful paintings or mosaics, many of which have deteriorated or disappeared, but the paintings in the Gabriel Chapel at Canterbury Cathedral survived because they were walled up in the 1100s, so their vivid colours and their style has survived. So the seeming severity that we saw in some of those Romanesque churches was relieved by these beautiful coloured frescoes. Here you can see a wonderful seraph on the left-hand side, reminding us of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Well, thank you again for joining us. There will be another presentation very soon on the Romanesque and pilgrimage churches and the cult of relics. Until then, thank you for listening, and cheerio for now.